keep forgetting about that. It'll be so nice when we're back in the, not in the studio, but out in the chamber. But anyway, welcome everyone, and call the meeting to order. And I'd like to welcome members of council and our administrative team that are here. Roll call. Councillor Altenhoff and Councillor Jobin are on personal leave. They are out celebrating their children's graduation. And so we are wishing them all the best this evening. And start with the land acknowledgement that we acknowledge that we are in the land and surrounded by water, originally inhabited by Indigenous peoples who have traveled this area since time immemorial. This territory is within the lands honored by the Wampum Treaties agreements between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and Shawnee, Lenni, and Lenape in allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Specifically, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, and the Huron-Wendat and peoples. And we are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture while remaining committed to moving forward respectfully with all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis nations. Any disclosure or pecuniary interest on the agenda is presented to you this afternoon. All right, hearing none. We'll have that duly noted. Thank you. So the introduction of our purpose of our meeting today is to hear public comment on the draft amending development charges bylaw. And I will call upon our Director of Development Services, Mr. Brian Hillman, to provide an update and introduce our delegation here this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good afternoon, Council, and all others who are attending. Yes, this is an update that you would have seen in the report as the result of a number of legislative changes that have occurred by way of provincial legislation over the last number of years. So we have retained the services of Watson and Associates, and a number of you will recall Gary Scanlon, who has worked with us on any number of our development charge background studies over the I can almost say decades now. So, and Darrell Labs works with him and really took the lead on this file with a number of departments at the town. So with that, they will be providing a PowerPoint that will summarize some of the findings and the nature of the study and the legislation that has prompted it. And then we'll go from there, Mr. Mayor. So with that, it's for Gary and Darrell. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Mr. Mayor, members of council, always a pleasure to be before you. I'm not sure, is the clerk have the presentation or are we pulling it up? There we go. Makes it easier. Thank you. So it's a pleasure. As noted by Mr. Hillman, there has been changes to the Development Charges Act, and that's allowed us to make some changes, which to some extent are positive for the municipality to recover more money. And there's certain instances where you may lose opportunities to collect funds. So I was going to briefly go through those changes for you and then talk about the implications. Next slide. So just as a quick overview, this, like any other public meeting, is just to present the findings of the study. The background study that we provided, it's mandatorily required to have this before you consider the bylaw. And so that will open and close. No consideration will be made today. And I'm obviously open to answer any questions of council or the public. Next slide. So as noted, there are changes to the Development Charges Act. Briefly, what they've done is they've allowed for some, if you recall, the softer services such as parks, recreation, library. Historically, there was a mandatory 10% deduction that we had to make so that the municipality to some extent had some contribution towards the works that were being provided. That has now been removed as a result of Bill 197. And so one of the things that we'll be doing is to remove that 10% calculation, which would obviously increase the amount of recovery and move you more towards full cost recovery for those particular services. There are additional exemptions and some refinements to the legislation. They've removed your ability to impose, should you have a university doing any type of facility in your municipality, you're no longer able to charge for universities. Colleges were exempt before, but now they've clarified university. There's also been some changes in the timing of payment with respect to nonprofit and rental housing and institutional. So if those developments come through, as of right, let's say a rental housing proposal has been made, that facility would not have to pay the development charge at the time of building permit, but they would pay at commencing at the time of occupancy, and then they'd pay over 5 years, and they'd be paying 1/6 of the payment upon occupancy, and then the residual 1/6 payments over the next 5 years. So that's for rental housing and institutional. And for nonprofit housing, they've allowed that to be paid over 21 installments for 20 years. Now, the municipality can impose additional interest so that you can, to some extent, inflate those costs or recover interest costs associated with that over a period of time. The other amendment they made was if there's a zoning amendment or a site plan, that the charges are frozen at the time that you accept the application as a complete application. And the charges are frozen until 2 years after you approve those developments. Once again, you can add interest cost associated with it. But if they build within 2 years after your approval, then is the charge plus the indexing. If they don't pull the building permits within the 2 years, then you end up just going back to whatever the charges are in place. So those are the mandated things. The one other thing I'd note is there's been, in working with staff, there's some refinements to some of the capital costs, and they've been updated in the calculations as well. So really, that's the heart of this presentation, and I'll just step through and give you a little bit more detail as we proceed through the presentation. Next slide. And this is just to identify the timelines. You'll recall that back in the end of 2015, we changed the public process to the extent that it's a minimum 60 days between when we release the background study and the first day council can consider the bylaw. So minimum 60 days. And then in between that 60-day period, we have to have the public meeting. So you can see we've been chatting with staff, in the early part of the year. We released the report in May 25th. July 26th is when council will consider the amending bylaw. So we meet that minimum 60 days. And obviously in between, which is today, we'll be having the public meeting. Next slide. Development charges are just for members of the public who may not be familiar with them. The legislation allows municipalities to recover costs associated with growth within the municipality. So we're trying to recover costs associated with infrastructure, and that will benefit both residential and non-residential growth within the municipality. Next slide. The current charges that are in place, you can see that we've got services related to a highway, which is basically roads and active transportation, sidewalks. We've got fire protection, police, indoor, outdoor recreation, so parks and recreation services, libraries, administrative studies, and water services. So those are imposed anywhere within the municipality. And that would be for a single detached unit would be $12,900. If you're receiving wastewater services, it's an extra $4,600. So in total, it would be as high as $17,500. Now those charges have been indexed since this period of time, but because we're making an amendment, we've got to go back, and the bylaw was passed in 2019. So we have to take any updated costs and basically deflate them back to 2019, change the bylaw, and then staff will inflate it back to today's dollars. So it's just a requirement that we have to do. Next slide. With respect to Parks and Rec, there are a couple of tweaks that we've made to the calculations. I've noticed in bullet 2 that the 10% deduction has been removed. So that has an upward increase on the charge as well. There's the pickleball complex, the revised estimate. We had that project in, but had it in at $500,000, and looking at it in 2019 dollars, it's now $660,000. So it's the latest and greatest price on it. So we've revised this. We've also just made an adjustment to the parks, to the park master plan for Lakewood. One extra thing is we've changed the name because the legislation has kind of changed the services names. So instead of indoor and outdoor recreation, we're now calling it Parks and Recreation. So next slide. Libraries, no project changes other than we removed that mandatory 10% deduction. So that once again, slight uptick in the charges we can impose. Next slide. And then growth studies, we've renamed it once again to administrative, to growth studies, and historically we call it admin studies. These are going to provide for water, wastewater, any studies that are related to water, wastewater, roads, stormwater, fire, police, etc. So we've refined the naming of those particular works. Next slide. The growth studies, once again, there were some of them that had the 10% deduction. We've removed that now, and then there's been some refinements to the cost and the timing of the projects, and you can see the full 4 small bullet points there. The sanitary sewer model update. So there's 2 provisions there. There's the Old Castle storm drainage master plan, and then there's the fire master plan. So we've made some refinements to those individual projects. Next slide. With respect to fire, the costing for the aerial truck has been updated from 1.6 million to 1.7. Once again, change in costing. And then there's been some additional vehicles that have been added into the project listing. Next slide. So as I've noted, we've made those changes that I made earlier on, I've noted have been incorporated into the draft bylaw. Some of the other things is that there's a mandatory exemption now for certain types of additional units. That would be if you have an ancillary building, such as a detached garage or a pool house, and you wanted to include an apartment unit in there, you could do so and no charge is payable. And for new homes, you can also, if you're building a brand new home, you could also add an additional apartment into that single family home, and you wouldn't be required to pay for the additional apartment. And as well, we've made a refinement. This isn't mandated, but we've refined the industrial exemption. There's a 50% expansion exemption for industrial. We've changed it slightly to be not only an expansion of the building, but an expansion on the individual property. So those are the additional adjustments that we've made if you take the time to look at the draft bylaw. Next slide. With respect to the charges, you can see we've highlighted that where the changes are, and these are the new updated calculations. Once again, these are in 2019 dollars. And I'll show a comparison on the next slide just to kind of isolate the magnitude of the changes on the next slide. So if we take a look at, oh, sorry, these are the changes for the indexing. I apologize. So this is the indexing up to 2022. So you can see that the full charges now for a single detached, all services included would be just below $21,000. If you're in the area that doesn't receive wastewater, you'd be at $15,600. And you can see correspondingly, as the unit size gets a little bit smaller, the charge correspondingly reduces. And then the non-residential charge has been adjusted as well. So I'll show some comparisons on the next two slides. And if we go to, this is based once again back on the 2019 dollars. You can see in total, we've increased the charges from about 17,500 to 18,700. So in and about a $1,200 increase. And you can see where the increases are on the fire, the parks and recreation, the library, and the growth, as I've noted earlier. Next slide. On the non-residential side, you can see similar types of adjustments, and we've gone from $6.72 per square foot to $7.14 per square foot. So roughly about 40-cent increase on the cost per square foot for non-residential buildings, that's commercial, industrial, institutional. Next slide. To compare, Tecumseh to its neighbors, and we even extended down the highway to be kind of west of the GTA. You can see the charges are noted here. The upper tier, so the county could impose a charge, but they don't currently. So that's what the orange denotes in, if you take a look at Kitchener, the orange is for the regional charge there. The local charge is the dark blue color, and school boards are allowed to charge as well, and they've been denoted in the green color. So you can see that Tecumseh is sitting at about the middle, and they're a little bit lower than LaSalle and considerably lower than Windsor. And so these are the single family residential rates. And you can see between the light blue and the green, it's just a marginal adjustment to the charge. Next slide. Similar type of comparison, but this is for commercial. You can see that we're now a little bit to the right of center. And once again, we're lower than places like LaSalle or Amherstburg or Lakeshore. Next slide. This is reflecting industrial. And once again, we're back into about the middle area. You can see there are a couple of municipalities such as Windsor who choose to exempt industrial. So they've now moved to the right-hand side, but we're still roughly in the middle of our comparator municipalities. Next slide. So that just concludes for the most part the presentation. From this point, we would be looking to be before council again on July 26th for the consideration of the amending bylaw. And I think that concludes the presentation, Mr. Mayor, and I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Scanlon. And before I open it up to members of council, just a question in terms of the new regulations that have come down from the provincial government, and you may notice about apartment style and multi-res, I guess, and rentals and I guess my question is that as an example, we have a 99 unit building that came in as a condominium, and then that changed to an apartment. And with the obviously with the intent of eventually converting it back to condominium after 10 years or so. Maybe Mr. Hillman can help me out here and on one of the units, but is there any type of safeguards, in dealing with that, where somebody comes in and says, we're going to do rentals, and then 10 years down the road says, no, we're going to sell the units?
So if they're apartments, probably what may be in your best interest, if you think that this may happen, is to maybe get into some form of delayed payment agreement, which acknowledges that if they flip it over time, that the charges are still due. I know they have to go through a process in order to convert from rental to condominium, and it does take a little bit of time. And I'm not familiar enough with the additional planning conditions that can be imposed. But if you have a feeling that that may occur, I would probably suggest that a delayed payment agreement, and you've got 10 years, after which, if you haven't converted it, then you don't have the obligation to pay. But keep in mind that the rental payment, you're not exempt, you're just given delayed payments.
Okay. I'll open it up. Obviously, any questions or comments? Go ahead, Councillor Houston.
Thank you, Worship. And through you to maybe Gary or Brian, just regarding the next few steps, we've received this today. I know it was open for public comment, but is there any other further comment if residents, see this and they want to provide anything? For me, it's pretty straightforward. It's about a 6% increase to development charges when we've applied, the 10% that you've mentioned, and we've got to pay for, the growth somehow. So, big proponent that growth pays for growth, and this is how we do it. But if residents want to provide any other comment, is it still open? Do they, send that to the town for receipt? If you could just comment on that.
So I can take the first step in that. Up until the bylaw is considered by council, I'm assuming that your procedural bylaw would allow for any information to be brought forth, if not only on the information section of your agenda. So obviously, there's always the opportunity to consider it. If you're speaking of the general residents, I would think that these changes are actually reducing the amount that we have to pay for off of property taxes. So I would expect from a general resident, they would see this as a probably more of a positive adjustment. With respect to developers, obviously there's about a $1,200 increase for single families. It's all in line with the legislation, but I'm sure if they wish to express themselves, that council would be open to receive any comments. Mr. Hillman, I'm happy to.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the only thing I would add is the way the legislation is set up, it is encouraging, some heavy front end engagement. So we've had the document on our website for 60 days as required by the Act, gave notice, hold the public meeting, and are anxious to bring it forward for council consideration. And we will prepare a report in that regard, just summarizing some very specific recommendations that we would like council to consider to keep it in line with the legislation. So it certainly is a quick moving process, but as Gary had indicated, if comments come in, we would certainly review those and give consideration to them in some manner. But we've fulfilled at this point, at least, the obligations for consultation under the Act.
All right. Anything further, members of council? I think that just one more comment from me in terms, I think in terms of the 10% piece, I mean, that was something that was, I know when I was the AMO president, when that came about, and certainly AMO was not very supportive of that at that particular time, because obviously to Councillor Houston's comment, growth should pay for growth for sure. The only, but on the flip side of that is the deferred payment piece itself. The only concern I have there moving forward, if you're into where you have to expand services, and whether it's fire services, whether it's expanding wastewater or water plants and so forth, you can't defer payment there. I mean, you got to pay for it, and so that's the only issue that I have, because I think and maybe our treasurer can look at it, but to me it's like taking on some debt that will be reflected to the municipality. If you've got to provide those services, you have to, no doubt. So if you have to advance some of those services because of the expansion, so it's kind of it's a good news, bad news thing. It's it's great that you're expanding and you're doing all of the good stuff, but depending on the type of development and so forth within the municipality and that, when you talk about 10 years and then 20 years, that's the only concern that I have, rightly or wrongly, but I think there's that issue for me. I'm not totally happy, I guess. So I suppose if everybody's not happy, then I guess the government did it right, the old saying. But that would be my concern. I don't know if you heard that from other municipalities, Gary. You know that you can mortgage so much, because of services, but and you want to expand, but you got to buy the services to support even the new growth, right, and so forth.
So to respond, Mr. Mayor, so what they have allowed is with those delayed payments for you to charge interest. And I didn't say inflation, which the development charges are adjusted for the construction cost index. What they've said is you can charge interest. So the cost of borrowing may be much different than the indexing. So I know there are municipalities who are to some extent reflecting whatever the indexing is, but there are municipalities who are looking at their cost of borrowing being in the range of like 5.5%. So they're charging every year a compound of 5.5%. And then there is one municipality who's in excess of 10%. So there's no cap on that interest rate, but to your point, if it's costing you more to go out and borrow, then you should at least reflect that borrowing rate as their cost to pay back to you.
Okay. I see Mr. Kitsel's camera came on, so maybe you've got something that you could add.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor, and Zora is also here as well. So, and I'll say Zora has been the primary finance team member working on the DC update. But what I can say is that as Gary had mentioned, the municipality does have the ability to charge interest. So we're currently working on a policy that would establish what interest we could charge. So that'll be forthcoming to council within the next month or so, I believe.
Okay.
Zora, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I think we're considering interest rates current. So the one thing Gary had mentioned, it could be something that fluctuates with the prime interest rate, prime borrowing rate.
Yeah, that would be, that'd certainly be my, my concern is to make sure that we don't go backwards and we maintain, at least what the current rates. Okay, any further questions? Well, nothing more. Then thank you, and looking forward to July and see the full presentation, and so we certainly want to thank Corporate Services and yourself, Mr. Scanlon and Mr. Abs. You have to beg my indulgence here. Good old allergies. Okay. Sorry about that. It's not that I'm all choked up about getting more revenue, but it's always nice to have, for sure. Okay. If nothing further, I want to thank you both, gentlemen, for attending our meeting today, and certainly Zora and Tom, and for the work that's gone into this, and looking forward to July when bylaws pass and we move forward. Communications, members of council, we do have one item of communications. Can I have a motion to receive? Thank you, Councilor Tonio, Councilor Houston. All in favor? Opposed, if any, that's carried. And also the report that's been brought forward, the DS 22-28 entitled Development Charges Update Study of June 28, 22 public meeting be received. Deputy Mayor Buchetti and Councilor Houston. On a motion, all in favor? Opposed, if any, that's carried. Thank you. And that brings us to adjournment. And so if I could have a motion to adjourn our proceedings. Councilor Houston, Councilor Tonio, all in favor? Opposed, that is carried. All right, thank you very much. And we are scheduled to come back online at 6 o'clock.